And about basic Spring Boot application, how it is performing component scan. Earlier we used to use context colon component scan. There we used to configure our package name, and I also used to read that package and create instances for all stereotype annotations which are we created using controller, controller, service, DAO or repository. And other configuration component annotation classes. Automatically it used to read and create objects, whereas Spring Boot application providing the default component scanning, right? Default component scanning it is provided. So this Spring Boot application is combination of component scan, enable default configurations, right? It is combination of three different other annotations. So one of which is component scan. So by default, Spring Boot application performs component scan configuration. Okay. So we understand component scan configuration coming up by default with Spring Boot application. That's where when we load that's where when we load our application that's where when we load our application into spring application dot run, it is able to scan your packages and create objects. So this statement is nothing but your application context ap equal to new class path xml application context. So this statement is similar to your starting application context only. So but this statement behave in different ways. Okay, when it is a web application, internally it will start the web XML application context. If it is simple default Spring Boot starter, then it will start application context only. Until unless you add web, it will not start web application context or dispatcher servlets. In addition to this, when you add web dependencies, it will start a dispatcher servlet and web application context everything. And a spring application dot run, when you load this class, as this class name annotated with this Spring Boot application, obviously it will scan your packages. The default packages it will scan, and it will create all the objects under that package or child package classes also. So the return type of this run method is application context. So you can get your IOC object in case if you want to invoke any bean in this main method class. You can invoke it as usual like your Spring Core, and you can get your beans here. If it is a standalone kind of one, if you want to execute methods here, from here you can execute it. Okay, so this is all with the Spring Boot application that we did. Once again, let me show you. Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. So this Spring Boot application mainly it is having these three annotations, right? Important annotations we have: component scan, enable auto configuration, okay, and Spring Boot configuration. So enable auto configuration also plays very important role in Spring application. It plays very important role. By default, this annotation is always available with Spring Boot application. So it will enable so many default configurations. Just when you add a dependency here, for that particular dependency, when you add a dependency to your application, right? Especially Spring Boot starters. For default starter, we have simple Spring Boot starter dependency here. When you add Spring Boot starter dependency itself, it is providing one Spring Boot auto configurer jar file. Here, when we observe it, right, we saw there are so many configurations has been provided in this default properties or JSON files. When we observe that, when we observe that, we see there are so many default configurations properties they have given with the default values. When all that default values will really function means when you add a dependency related to that particular property. Just a minute. So you can see there are so many default auto configuration classes, but all these classes may not activate until unless that particular dependency added into your application. So we have JPA defaults, JDBC defaults, data source defaults. There are so many default configuration names has been given. Okay. So when this class will be really available, names are available here, but this class will be available once you add JDBC dependency, Spring JDBC dependency, or when you add data JPA, actual data JPA class will be available in your class path. As of now, only we have, yeah. So Hibernate default configurations, so many default configurations, names available here, but classes. But this one, the class is not available. So until unless class is not available in this class path, these classes also, right, default classes, which are classes they have given, those classes also at the rate, for example, that data source or Hibernate or JMS, so many classes given. All that classes are, yeah, if you see real class name, so if you see class Hibernate configuration, so default came with auto configuration, a configuration. It is providing support for auto configuration. So it is showing the dependencies also. After data source initialization, after transaction manager customization auto configuration, and before, after dependencies also mentioned here when this one actually should be executed and all. So by default, these are again auto configuration annotation. If you explore more, auto configuration must be annotated with configuration annotation. Okay, you know configuration also one of the stereotype, right? So when this default configuration classes are available in class path, which class path? The default class path, org spring boot. When it find under org.springboot framework, spring framework dot boot, under the child package, if it find any default configurations, by default objects it will create, like your stereotyped annotations, right? Like your objects for application, whichever classes you have created, for those classes how it is creating object, the same way it will create objects for their default configuration classes also, whether it is your configuration class or a predefined configuration class which is available in the class path. Okay, if it is your configuration, you are writing this class. So the predefined configuration classes also available here under default spring packages. So those classes also it will create automatically. So those class objects also it will create automatically. We can see them actually. We can see which all classes are created. Which all classes are created, right? We can see. We can see all that class names. I believe there should be a way. In this default application, yesterday we just created a default application and we saw with the default application, just we saw what properties, what dependencies we have and all. So now if you want to observe what all classes or what are all beans it is creating, let's inspect. It is providing, right, application context object. application context. So is there any method verify to get all the bean names? Get bean definitions, get bean definition names, returns the names of all the beans defined in this factory. It is telling that all the bean names it will provide. Just names of your beans it will provide in the form of string array. Okay, just get this string array here and see what are all the bean names it is initialized. Okay, so it is default application. We don't have any class apart from this default main method class which is generated automatically. No other class. So just print each bean name. So application getting started, and it is printing a lot of names here. Okay, this many objects it is created. What are all they all are defaults. By default, when you run this application context, right, these are all the default beans that your IOC context is creating. Let me put them into notepad or somewhere. So why you need to do this exercise, why you need to know about all of them means maybe sometimes your application may not require all these beans. This unnecessary objects load you may not require on your application. Okay, in such scenarios you may need to disable them when you not really require those all beans. You need not to maintain them. So if you see here, internal configuration processor, internal auto-wired annotation post processor, internal common annotation processor, internal event listener processor, default starter application, internal caching metadata factory, auto configuration packages, property placeholder auto configurer. This is again one of the important annotation. Property source placeholder configuration. So by default, all these are enabled. All these beans are default enabled. AOP auto configuration. Check configuration properties, bound configuration properties. So when you really don't want any bean out of it, right? You can disable them. You can disable them by just configuring that class name. Let's say internal caching metadata reader factory. Something a bean class it is creating. In case if you want to exclude it, here maybe you can put exclude, give that class name. So include, exclude options given. When you put exclude, excuse me. Exclude, is it the package name? Exclude specific auto configuration classes such that they will never be applied. Exclude names. Okay, just given this name, that's how it will function. Fully qualified class name it will expect, or without any issues this is executed. Internal cache metadata reader factory. So you can see, still we can see this class. Maybe let's find out actual class name to exclude it. Well, this application class is not showing. API documentation not showing, right? Is it creating by a factory class? That we should understand again. Not sure, but exclude a name or but I don't see this class is available. When such class available, ID should able to identify it. Why this class is not visible? Maybe a final class or is something a protected class, I don't know. Still it should be visible. Okay, anyway, we will write custom classes and we will exclude them. And here we can give package expression exclude star auto configuration. So it is not excluding. I can see the bean names. returns the names of all the beans defined in this factory, does not consider any hierarchy in this factory, may participate in. It ignores any singleton beans that have been registered by other beans than just defines. Anything wrong that we did? Exclude names. Okay, we will see this. Okay, how we can exclude them. Just keep it aside. So whichever defaults it is providing, using exclude option, we should able to disable them also if we don't want. And by default, it is providing core dependencies, AOP, and for logging purpose, logger dependencies also it is providing. Okay, so we need not to discuss about core dependencies. We know all the core features. Um, there is a profiles concept. Okay, and reading properties from properties file. I'll show you in one example now. Okay, apart from that, auto wiring, component scanning, everything we are aware, and maybe expressions it is showing. We will see how better we can use Spring expression language and how we can apply log4j also. We will see. Okay, so coming to properties, let's say I have few properties here, my custom properties. How can I load them in? I have properties here, my application name, something, a com dot application name dot some configuration property. I have driver or some config URL. I want to use that. I want to use that in my application. Something HTTP localhost. So this property I want to read in my application. So how I can read such properties? How I can get that properties? Let's say if I create a class here, a configuration class, app config at the rate configuration at the rate property source. We can give our properties file name here or property source. So just give your property file name here. Okay, so class path resources. By default, if we don't configure, let's see whether it will load. Okay, expecting. Okay, resources slash application dot properties. Here, I want that URL property, URL value I want here. So you can use at the rate value annotation, and here you can give the property key, whichever we have here. So this key we can configure here. So when we give this value key for this key, whichever value we have, right, this value must be assigned to this particular variable so that you can utilize that within your method. Let's say at the rate bean method I have. There I want to use it. Okay. Public something date. Just my intention is not to create date, but I just want to show you URL here. URL value, if I try to print, it should able to show me that URL. So any custom properties if you have, you can load them. Again, to read the properties from properties file, there are many ways. Okay, without configuring the value also here we can read them. By default, if we follow naming conventions, right, all these properties will be loaded here. We can see that as well. So if I run this application now, will it show me that property? It is saying resources application dot properties not available yet. Application dot properties. Not this one. Property placeholder configurer we will use. Hmm, property source. So it is to read from your class. Not exactly this one. There is another annotation. Or if I don't configure it, will it load by default? Yeah, by default it is loading. Is it printing somewhere localhost? Or just printing none? Let me comment it and verify. com.appname.config URL. Acha. So it needs expression, I believe. Same value it is showing if I don't put expression. If I put expression, then localhost value bring in here. So now it is reading the property and showing it here. This session may end, okay, in 1 minute. If it ends, we will rejoin, okay. Yeah. Or else let me close and restart it, okay. I'll just stop it and restart it. Please rejoin. Yeah, recording is on. We will see how we can load properties without using at the rate value also. Okay, so here we use at the rate value and the property has been loading from by default properties. Sorry. Yeah, yeah. Did I share my screen before? Yes, right. Yeah, in previous. Yeah, yeah. It is visible, right? So using yeah. So using this property key, we are loading it. Let's say I don't want to use key and I want to load properties. All my database properties I want to load here, which is specific to driver or database. So consider I have db config class here and I want to load properties particular to db, something database dot url, database username, database password, something like this. I have properties jdbc colon article. So I want to get these properties into this configuration class. So here if I declare my variables private string url, just if I follow naming conventions, same naming conventions whichever I have there in the properties file. After database dot, I have URL, username, password. So I'm just keeping this common name and is specific to each property created as a variable here. So how I can get these properties, database URL, username, password into my configuration class. So earlier what we have used is a simple mention, a simple configuration class. Not only configuration class, you can use any stereotype annotation here. You can use any stereotype annotation here, and if you mention at the rate value, the values by default it will load if you give key here. But without the key, if I give key here, it will load. But without this key also I want to load. I just don't want to put any key. Just by following naming conventions, I want to get them here. So you can use at the rate configuration properties annotation, and here you can give prefix. What is the prefix for this properties? URL, username, password. Any stereotype annotation class. Imagine it is a controller or service DAO or a component class, configuration class, any class. I want some properties which are there in this properties file. I want properties which are there in this properties file here. So using at the rate value you can get them. Now I want to avoid that at the rate value just by keeping the prefix of it. Database is a prefix. And using these suffixes as a variable names here, I want to get them. So use configuration properties annotation, give the prefix. So by default it will load your properties here. So you can check them if you want. You can check them if you want. Public date, nothing to do with this date, just a simple bean and Instead of that, maybe here you can create a connection object using your properties and return that connection or data source, to URL, username, password. Fine. Something suggesting add Spring Boot configuration processor to form file. It is given one suggestion. Yeah. Configuration processor dependency in addition to this properties it is adding. We will comment it and try it also. Let it update. Now if I run, it is waiting for malware. Let's go on mute. Okay. If you want to talk, you can unmute. Just a minute. Let it finish. We'll talk more about these properties later also. Okay. Just I'm giving you basic examples. In profiles again we will see these properties. Very very important concept. Spring profiling. Okay. We will have so much extensive discussion on that. It is taking much time. Blocked the user operations. Why default updates are I'll terminate and restart it. So let's run it and see. What about this dbconfig class configuration prefix we have given? Oh, chai, at the rate bean is missing. Yeah, keep it at the rate bean. Yeah, not only under at the rate bean method, you can use anywhere. Once this property is being loaded into your class, you can load it. You can read it anywhere. Create the date definition in the class path resource. App config class. Okay. So by default, whatever app config class and overriding is disabled. Acha, db config class is a default class that it is having. Is that it is saying? Let me rename it. App db config something. Acha, create a date method is duplicate. So two beans are getting created with this create a date here and create a date here. Okay. Null. Properties are not being added. So by default with this prefix they should have come here. Let's add this property. Oh, this is there. Prefixes database. Correct only, right? So it is not coming. We need to mention at the rate configuration properties. It is there. Property source. Configuration properties. Prefix is fine. Hmm. Database dot URL username password. This has to be loaded by default at any cost, but it is showing null. Okay, what is the problem? configuration properties which we have added. Correct only, right? We have used a component configuration also should be fine. Configuration properties. Do I need you think generate getters and setters mandatory when I don't use value annotation? Let's put maybe via setters. Is it trying to access? Correct. So it is expecting setters. So via setters it is able to inject your properties when you follow naming convention. Without value annotation also it is just allowing us. All we need to do is at the rate configuration properties with your property key prefix and the suffixes as a variable names you can declare with the setter methods. It is expecting setters. If you don't want setters and getters here, maybe use at the rate data lombok annotation. It provides all this, okay? So if you add lombok dependency, that's all it will function. Okay. We will see this extension in profiles discussion. Okay. For now, I'll just keep it aside.